Sometimes love finds you when you're not looking for it, in the most unexpected places, reminding you that laughter can heal even the loneliest heart. For Josie Lynn Calder, that moment came deep in the scrub-brushed woods outside Whistling Gulch, when she discovered a giant cowboy hanging upside down from a cottonwood tree, caught by his ankles in a hunting trap. His boots flailed helplessly, his hat lay crumpled in the dirt, and his pride hung as low as he did. But when this stranger named Thatcher Boone looked up at her with a crooked grin and said, "Ma'am, if you ain't an angel, could you at least cut me down before I pass out?" Something warm stirred in Josie's chest. She burst out laughing, and he smiled back like sunshine breaking through clouds. What started as a rescue became something neither expected when bounty hunters arrived, claiming Thatcher was wanted for a crime. But what if the trap wasn't meant for wild hogs? What if someone wanted Thatcher found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the eastern hills of Whistling Gulch in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the valley that Josie Lynn Calder had called home for all her 28 years. She sat astride her chestnut Mustang, Copper, on the ridge overlooking her family's ranch, breathing in the crisp October air that carried the scent of sage and the promise of winter. The worn leather saddle beneath her had belonged to her father, Samuel Calder, and before him, his father. 3 generations of Calders had worked this land, shaped it, loved it, and now it fell to her alone to carry on that legacy. Josie adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and surveyed the spread below with the practiced eye of someone who knew every fence post, every water source, every quirk of the terrain. The Double C Ranch stretched across 1,500 acres of prime grazing land, bordered by cottonwood-lined creeks and rolling hills dotted with mesquite and juniper. It wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it was hers, and she'd fought tooth and nail to keep it after her father's passing 3 years prior. The ranch house sat in a grove of ancient oaks, its white-painted porch and green shutters a beacon of home against the vast landscape. Smoke curled from the kitchen chimney, where Rosa Delgado, the housekeeper who'd helped raise Josie after her mother's death when she was 12, would be preparing breakfast for the hands. The barn and outbuildings clustered nearby like chicks around a hen, practical and weathered, each structure telling the story of generations of hard work and careful stewardship. "Come on, Copper," Josie murmured, pressing her heels gently against the horse's flanks. "Let's go see what mischief those cattle have gotten themselves into." As they descended toward the valley floor, Josie's thoughts turned to the challenges that seemed to multiply with each passing season. Cattle prices had dropped again, and the bank in town was making increasingly uncomfortable noises about the loan her father had taken out to modernize the operation before his sudden heart attack. She'd managed to keep current on the payments, but barely, and winter feed would strain their resources further. The sound of hoofbeats approached from behind, and Josie turned to see Jake Morrison riding up on his paint gelding. Jake had worked for the Calders for 15 years, starting as a green kid fresh from Arkansas and growing into the most reliable foreman Josie could ask for. His weathered face bore the marks of sun and wind, and his grey-streaked beard framed a mouth that was quicker to smile than to complain. "Morning, Miss Josie," Jake called, touching the brim of his hat. "Got word from Charlie that we're missing about 24 head from the north pasture. Fence looked intact when he checked yesterday evening." Josie frowned. Cattle didn't just vanish, especially not that many at once. Any sign of where they might have wandered? Charlie found some tracks heading toward the woods past Devil's Creek. Could be they spooked at something and ran. Or Jake's voice trailed off, but Josie caught his meaning. Or someone drove them off, she finished grimly. Cattle rustling had become more common in recent months, with desperate men taking advantage of isolated ranches and overworked sheriffs. "Take Tommy and Lewis with you to check the fence line again. I'll follow those tracks into the woods." Jake's expression grew concerned. "Miss Josie, you shouldn't go alone. If there's trouble—" "I can handle myself," Josie interrupted, patting the Winchester rifle secured in her saddle scabbard. Samuel Calder had taught his daughter to shoot before she could properly ride, and she'd won the county marksmanship contest 3 years running. Besides, if it's just spooked cattle, one rider can herd them back easier than a group. Jake knew better than to argue when Josie's jaw set in that particular stubborn line. He'd watched her grow from a gangly girl into a woman who could outshoot, outride, and outwork most men in the territory, but he still felt protective of the child he'd helped teach to rope and brand. At least take the dog, he compromised, whistling for Blue, a aging but still sharp-eyed border collie who'd been Samuel's constant companion. Josie smiled, the expression softening her sun-bronzed features. Fair enough. Blue could use the exercise anyway. As Jake rode off toward the ranch buildings to gather the other hands, Josie urged Copper toward Devil's Creek, named for the treacherous currents that had claimed more than one unwary traveler over the years. The creek marked the eastern boundary of Double Sea Land, beyond which lay thousands of acres of untamed wilderness, where a person could disappear for days without seeing another soul. The tracks Jake had mentioned were easy enough to follow. Cattle weren't subtle creatures, and 24 of them left a trail a child could read. Josie followed the signs through the sparse grass and into the thicker vegetation near the creek, Blue trotting alongside, with his tongue lolling happily. The woods beyond the creek held a different quality of silence, deeper and more watchful than the open range. Ancient cottonwoods and post oaks created a canopy that filtered the morning light into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Josie had played in these woods as a child, knew every deer path and hidden spring, but today something felt different. The usual birdsong seemed muted, and Copper's ears kept swiveling forward as if listening for sounds only he could hear. They'd been following the trail for perhaps an hour when Josie heard it, a low, rhythmic creaking sound that didn't belong in the natural symphony of the forest. She reined Copper to a halt and listened intently, trying to place the source. Blue's hackles rose slightly, and he whined softly, looking up at Josie with intelligent brown eyes. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, dismounting and leading Copper forward on foot. The creaking grew louder as they approached a small clearing dominated by a massive cottonwood tree whose gnarled branches spread like arthritic fingers against the sky. And there, suspended upside down from one of those branches, was the largest man Josie had ever seen. He hung perhaps 8 feet off the ground, his ankles caught in what appeared to be a hunting snare designed for much smaller prey. His dark hair fell away from a face that, even viewed upside down, showed strong, honest features beneath several days' worth of stubble. His clothesa blue work shirt, leather vest, and canvas pants were dust-covered and rumpled from his ordeal, and his hat lay forlorn on the ground beneath him like a punctuation mark to his predicament. What struck Josie most, however, was not his size or his situation, but the fact that he was conscious and remarkably calm for a man in such an undignified position. When he heard her approach, he turned his head, an awkward maneuver given his orientation, and fixed her with eyes the color of summer sky. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that spoke of places farther south, "this is either the answer to my prayers or I've finally lost what little sense I had left." Josie found herself fighting back a smile. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride, ma'am, and that's been through worse." He attempted something that might have been a shrug, though the effect was lost in his current position. "Though I'll admit the blood's been rushing to my head for a spell now, and I'm starting to see spots that ain't there." "How long have you been hanging there?" Josie asked, moving closer to examine the snare. It was professionally made, she noted, with heavy rope and a trigger mechanism more sophisticated than anything a casual trapper would use. "Since before dawn, best I can figure. Was tracking a wounded boar through the dark, fool thing to do. I know, and stepped right into this contraption." He managed to gesture vaguely at the trap with one large hand. "Name's Thatcher Boone, by the way, and you'd be my guardian angel, I'm hoping." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Josie felt laughter bubbling up in her chest. There was something about his matter-of-fact acceptance of his circumstances, combined with the polite formality of his introduction while hanging upside down like a possum, that struck her as wonderfully absurd. "Josie Calder," she replied, already reaching for the knife at her belt. "And I'm no angel, Mr. Boone, but I can cut rope well enough." "Ma'am, if you ain't an angel, could you at least cut me down before I pass out?" Thatcher asked, and despite his predicament, his eyes crinkled with humor. "I'd hate to meet a lady as pretty as you while unconscious." The laughter Josie had been suppressing finally escaped, bright and genuine in the quiet forest. "You certainly know how to make an impression, Mr. Boone." "Not exactly the impression I was aiming for," Thatcher admitted with a rueful grin that transformed his entire face, softening the harsh planes and making him look younger, more approachable. As Josie worked to cut him down carefully, so he wouldn't crash to the ground like a felled trees, he found herself studying this stranger who'd quite literally dropped into her mourning. He was indeed a giant of a man, probably 6.5 feet tall, and built like someone who'd spent his life doing hard physical work. But his hands, when she helped steady him as he regained his footing, were gentle, and his thank you was spoken with genuine gratitude rather than wounded masculine pride. "That's quite a trap," Josie observed, examining the cut rope and sophisticated trigger mechanism. "Seems like overkill for hunting wild pigs." Thatcher, still wobbling slightly as his circulation returned to normal, retrieved his hat and dusted it off. "That's what I was thinking. Almost like someone set it for—" He paused, glancing at Josie with a suddenly cautious expression. "For what?" "Nothing, ma'am. Just grateful to be right side up again." But Josie caught the shadow that passed over his features, a wariness that suggested Thatcher Boone had more on his mind than an unfortunate encounter with a hunting trap. Blue, who had been watching the proceedings with canine interest, suddenly stiffened and growled low in his throat, his attention fixed on something beyond the clearing. In the distance, Josie could hear the sound of approaching horses, several of them, moving at a steady pace through the forest. Thatcher heard them too, and his entire demeanor changed, the easygoing stranger replaced by someone alert and potentially dangerous. "Miss Calder," he said quietly, "I think it might be best if you headed back to wherever you came from." "Why?" Josie demanded, her hand instinctively moving toward her rifle. "Who's coming?" Before Thatcher could answer, 3 riders emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing, their horses lathered with sweat as if they'd been riding hard. They were rough-looking men, the kind who lived by their guns and asked questions later. The leader, a thin man with pale eyes and a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, looked from Thatcher to Josie with calculating interest. "Well, well," the deputy said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thatcher Boone, been looking all over creation for you." Josie felt Thatcher tense beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Deputy Walsh," he acknowledged. "Can't say I'm surprised to see you." "I'll bet you can't." Walsh's pale eyes shifted to Josie, taking in her rifle, her confident posture. The way she stood slightly protectively in front of Thatcher, despite having known him for less than an hour. "And who might you be, miss?" "Josie Calder. This is my land you're riding on." "The Calder Ranch." Walsh nodded slowly. "Heard your daddy was a good man. Shame about his passing." The words were polite, but something in his tone made them sound more like a threat than condolence. "What do you want with Mr. Boone?" Josie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Walsh reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he shook out and held up for her to see. It was a wanted poster, bearing a reasonably good likeness of Thatcher's face above the words, "Wanted for murder and cattle rustling, 500 reward." "Thatcher Boone," Walsh read aloud, "wanted for the murder of rancher William Morrison and the theft of 40 head of cattle from the Morrison spread near Copper Falls. Last seen heading east." He folded the poster and tucked it away. "That'd be you, wouldn't it, Boone?" Josie looked at Thatcher, searching his face for some sign of guilt or fear, but found only a weary sadness and something that looked remarkably like resignation. "That would be me," Thatcher confirmed quietly, "though not for the reasons that poster claims. Funny thing, though," Walsh continued, his pale eyes never leaving Thatcher's face. "We heard you might be in these parts, so we set some traps." Amazing how well they work. His gaze flicked meaningfully to the cut rope still dangling from the cottonwood branch. The pieces clicked together in Josie's mind with horrible clarity. The sophisticated trap, the men arriving so conveniently after Thatcher had been found, the deputy's lack of surprise at their presence. None of this was coincidence. "You set that trap for him," she said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. Walsh shrugged. "A man's got to use all the tools at his disposal when he's hunting dangerous fugitives. Speaking of which," he gestured to his companions, who began to spread out around the clearing. "Thatcher Boone, you're under arrest for murder. You have the right to remain silent, though I can't promise you'll make it back to Copper Falls alive if you try to run." "I won't run," Thatcher said quietly, his hands held slightly away from his sides in a gesture of surrender. "But I didn't kill William Morrison, and I didn't steal his cattle." "That's for a judge to decide," Walsh replied, "assuming you live long enough to see one." The threat was barely veiled, and Josie felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd heard stories about Deputy Walsh, none of them good. Men who rode with him had a tendency to resist arrest in fatal ways, and witnesses to those incidents were scarce on the ground. "He's under my protection," Josie heard herself say, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Walsh's eyebrows rose mockingly. "Your protection? Miss Calder, this man is a wanted killer. You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "Maybe not," Josie replied, stepping closer to Thatcher. "But I know right from wrong when I see it, and I know when someone's being railroaded." The clearing fell silent except for the nervous shifting of horses and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Josie was acutely aware of the rifle in her hands, of Blue pressed against her leg, of Thatcher's steady breathing beside her. Most of all, she was aware of the choice. She was making a choice that would change everything that came after. "Miss Calder," Thatcher said softly, "you don't need to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted, never taking her eyes off Deputy Walsh. "This is my land, and you're my guest. That makes this my business." Walsh studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes calculating odds and consequences. Finally, he smiled, but it was the cold smile of a predator who'd found easier prey elsewhere. "Well then," he said, gathering his reins, "I guess we'll be seeing you both real soon. Thatcher, you enjoy Miss Calder's hospitality while you can. Won't last long once word gets around about what you've done." With that ominous promise, Walsh and his men turned their horses and disappeared back into the forest, leaving Josie and Thatcher alone in the suddenly quiet clearing. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, both processing what had just happened and what it might mean. "You shouldn't have done that," Thatcher finally said, his voice heavy with regret. "Done what?" "Put yourself between me and them. Now you're involved, and Walsh isn't the kind of man who forgets a grudge." Josie turned to face him fully, studying the face that had gone from amusement to weariness to something approaching despair in the space of an hour. "Did you kill William Morrison?" "No." "Did you steal his cattle?" "No." "Then why are they after you?" Thatcher was quiet for so long that Josie began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because sometimes, Miss Calder, the truth isn't nearly as convenient as a lie. And because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, asking the wrong questions about the wrong people." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was enough for now. Josie found herself believing him, not just because of his words, but because of something she saw in his icy, bone-deep honesty that couldn't be faked. "Well then," she said, shouldering her rifle, "I guess we'd better figure out how to prove your innocence before Deputy Walsh decides to solve his problem the permanent way." Thatcher stared at her, as if she'd grown a second head. "We? You saved my cattle from getting lost in these woods. The least I can do is return the favor." It was a thin justification, and they both knew it, but it would have to do for now. As they walked back toward where Copper waited patiently, Blue trotting beside them, Josie found herself wondering what she'd gotten herself into. She'd always been impulsive, but harboring a wanted man was beyond even her usual standards for questionable decisions. Yet when she glanced at Thatcher Booneth's gentle giant who'd made her laugh while hanging upside down from a tree, who'd surrendered without a fight to protect her from getting caught in crossfire, who carried himself like a man with nothing to hide, he knew she'd made the right choice. The only question now was whether they'd both live long enough to prove it. The ride back to the Double C passed in companionable silence, with Thatcher walking alongside Copper while Josie remained mounted. She'd offered to let him ride double, but he'd declined with a self-deprecating smile, saying he was too heavy and the horse had carried enough burden for one day. Blue trotted between them, occasionally looking up at Thatcher with the kind of canine approval that spoke volumes about a man's character. As they crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, Josie felt a familiar swell of pride at the sight of her family's legacy spread out below. But today, that pride was tempered by uncertainty about what bringing Thatcher home might mean for everything she'd worked to protect. "It's beautiful," Thatcher said quietly, pausing to take in the view. "Your father built something lasting here. 3 generations of Calders built this," Josie corrected, though not unkindly. "I'm just trying not to be the one who loses it." Something in her tone made Thatcher look at her more closely. "Trouble?" "The usual kind. Too much debt, not enough rain, cattle prices dropping faster than a stone in a well." She shrugged, trying to make light of worries that kept her awake most nights. "Nothing that can't be solved with a few good seasons and some luck." They were halfway down the slope when Jake Morrison appeared from behind the barn, leading his paint gelding. When he spotted Josie approaching with a stranger, his weathered face creased into a frown of concern. By the time they reached the yard, Jake had been joined by Charlie Winters and Luis Mendoza, 2 of the ranch's most loyal hands. "Miss Josie," Jake called, his eyes never leaving Thatcher. "Find those missing cattle?" "Found them heading toward the creek, just like you said." Josie dismounted and handed Copper's reins to Charlie. "This is Thatcher Boone. He helped me track them down." Jake's expression remained carefully neutral, but Josie caught the subtle shift in his posture that meant he was ready for trouble. At 52, Jake had seen enough of the world to know when something didn't sit right, and a stranger appearing out of nowhere always raised questions. "Much obliged, Mr. Boone," Jake said, extending his hand in greeting. When Thatcher clasped it, Jake winced slightly at the grip. "You've got hands like a man who knows his way around hard work." "Yes, sir. Been earning my keep with these hands most of my life." "And what brings you to our neck of the woods?" Before Thatcher could answer, the sound of hoofbeats announced new arrivals. Deputy Walsh and his 2 companions rode into the yard as if they owned it, their horses' hooves striking sparks off the hard-packed earth. The deputy's pale eyes swept the assembled group with predatory interest. "Afternoon, folks," Walsh called, dismounting with deliberate casualness. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Jake stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered Colt. "Deputy, what brings you out our way?" Walsh reached into his vest and withdrew that damning piece of paper, the wanted poster, that seemed to follow Thatcher like a shadow. He held it up for everyone to see, watching their faces as recognition dawned. "Looking for this man," Walsh announced. "Thatcher Boone, wanted for murder and cattle rustling, last seen in this area." His cold gaze fixed on Thatcher. "Funny thing is, we just ran into him about an hour ago, but he managed to slip away in all the confusion." Josie felt her heart sink as she watched Jake's expression change from cautious welcome to grim suspicion. Charlie and Luis exchanged glances, their hands drifting toward their weapons. These men had followed her father through drought and flood, had helped raise her after her mother's death, and their loyalty to the Calder family was absolute. But harboring a wanted killer was asking too much of even the strongest bonds. "That true, Mr. Boone?" Jake asked quietly. "You wanted for murder?" Thatcher stood perfectly still, his hands visible and empty, making no threatening moves, despite being outnumbered 6-1. "There's a warrant with my name on it," he said carefully, "but I didn't kill William Morrison, and I didn't steal his cattle." "Course that's what you'd say," one of Walsh's men sneered. "Every killer claims he's innocent." "Some of them actually are," Josie interjected, stepping closer to Thatcher. The movement wasn't lost on anyone present. She was choosing sides, and everyone knew it. Walsh's smile was thin and cold. "Miss Calder, you seem like a sensible woman. Surely you don't want to harbor a dangerous fugitive on your property. Think about what that might do to your reputation in town, to your business relationships." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. In a community where a person's word was their bond, being associated with criminal activity could destroy everything Josie had worked to preserve. She felt the weight of generations of Calder integrity pressing down on her shoulders. "Jake," she said quietly, "what do you think?" Jake Morrison had known Josie since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, had watched her grow from a wild-haired tomboy into a woman who could run a ranch as well as any man in the territory. He'd also learned to read people in his 52 years, and something about this whole situation struck him as wrong. "I think," Jake said slowly, "that a man who'd helped track down missing cattle and then come home for supper isn't acting much like someone with murder on his conscience." Walsh's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Morrison. All of you. This man is dangerous. Dangerous enough that you had to set a trap for him instead of facing him straight up," Josie asked sweetly. The deputy's face flushed with anger. "I don't know what you're talking about. That snare in the cottonwood grove was set for a man, not a pig. Professional work. Too sophisticated for casual hunting." Josie's voice carried the authority of someone who'd grown up in these woods. "Makes a person wonder who might have the skills and motivation to set such a thing." For a moment, Walsh looked genuinely dangerous, his hand moving toward his gun. But then he seemed to remember where he was and how many witnesses were present. Instead, he remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. "You're all making a serious mistake," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "When that killer shows his true colors, don't come crying to me for help." "Wouldn't dream of it," Jake replied mildly. Walsh wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the gate, his companions following. But before they reached the property line, he turned back for one final warning. "Enjoy your new hand, Miss Calder, but don't get too attached. Men like Boone don't stick around long one way or another." After the sound of hoofbeats faded, the yard fell into an uncomfortable silence. Charlie and Lewis looked uncertain, caught between loyalty to Josie and the natural fear of being associated with a wanted man. Jake stood with his arms crossed, studying Thatcher with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Well," Jake finally said, "I reckon if Miss Josie vouches for you, that's good enough for me. But I'd like to hear your side of this story." Thatcher looked around the circle of faces, some friendly, some suspicious, all waiting for answers. "It's not a pretty tale." "Most true ones aren't," Josie said gently. Thatcher took a deep breath and began. "William Morrison was a good man, ran an honest operation up near Copper Falls. About 2 months ago, he started losing cattle to rustlers, exactly, but to what looked like legal sales. Someone was forging bills of sale, using his name and brand to move stolen livestock through legitimate channels." "Clever," Jake murmured. "Hard to prove theft when the paperwork looks legal. Morrison hired me to investigate. I'd done some work for the Cattlemen's Association, had a reputation for tracking down rustlers and brand runners." Thatcher's expression grew grim. "What I found was bigger than just cattle theft. There was a whole network of corrupt officials, crooked dealers, even some legitimate ranchers who were willing to look the other way for a cut of the profits. And Morrison started asking too many questions, made too much noise about what we'd discovered." Thatcher's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Found him shot in the back on his own land, his cattle gone, and my horse tied up outside his house like I'd been there for a social call. Frame job," Jake said grimly. "Clean and simple. By the time I realized what had happened, half the territory was looking for me with shoot-to-kill orders." Thatcher looked directly at Josie. "That's why I said you shouldn't get involved. These people don't leave loose ends." Rosa Delgado appeared on the porch, drawn by the commotion. At 60, she was still a formidable woman, with silver-streaked hair and dark eyes that missed nothing. She'd been with the Calders since before Josie was born, and had earned the right to speak her mind on any subject concerning the family. "What's all this fuss about?" she demanded in accented English. "Rosa, this is Thatcher Boone," Josie said. "He's going to be staying with us for a while." Rosa studied Thatcher with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd raised children and knew how to spot trouble. After a long moment, she nodded approvingly. "He looks hungry," she announced. "Bring him inside. A man can't think properly on an empty stomach." As the group began to disperse, Jake lingered beside Josie. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Once word gets around town, there'll be no taking it back." Josie watched Thatcher follow Rosa toward the house, his movements careful and grateful, like a man who hadn't experienced kindness in a long time. "I'm sure, Jake. There's something about him he could have run when Walsh showed up, could have used me as a hostage or bargaining chip. Instead, he was ready to surrender to protect me from getting caught in the middle. Could be an act. Could be, but I don't think so." She turned to meet Jake's worried gaze. "My father always said, the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are watching, but what he does when he thinks nobody will ever know. Thatcher thought he was going to die hanging from that tree, but when I found him, he was polite and grateful, and even tried to make me laugh. That's not the kind of thing a killer does." Jake sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of Josie's jaw that meant further argument was pointless. "Well then, I guess we'd better figure out how to keep you both alive long enough to prove his innocence." As they walked toward the house, Josie reflected on how quickly her quiet morning had transformed into something that could either save an innocent man or destroy everything her family had built. But looking at the wanted poster that Walsh had left behind, crumpled now and blowing across the yard in the evening breezes, he knew she'd made the only choice her conscience would allow. The real question was whether conscience would be enough to keep them all from paying the ultimate price for doing what was right. Rosa Delgado's kitchen had always been the heart of the Double C Ranch, and tonight it seemed to wrap around Thatcher Boone like a warm embrace. The long oak table that had served 3 generations of Calders was set for supper, with Rosa's famous cornbread cooling on the sideboard and the rich aroma of beef stew filling the air. Thatcher sat across from Josie, his large frame making the sturdy chair look delicate, while Jake occupied his usual spot at the head of the table. "Eat," Rosa commanded, ladling another generous portion into Thatcher's bowl. "You're too skinny for such a big man." Thatcher smiled, the first genuine smile Josie had seen from him since the encounter with Deputy Walsh. "Yes, ma'am. This is the finest meal I've had in months." "Where have you been staying?" Josie asked, studying his weathered clothes and the tired lines around his eyes. "Here and there, sleeping rough mostly, trying to stay ahead of the bounty hunters." Thatcher broke off a piece of cornbread, savoring it like a man who'd forgotten what home cooking tasted like. "Hard to find folks willing to help a wanted man, and I don't blame them for it." Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Tell me about this network you mentioned. How deep does it run?" Thatcher was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small, worn objector, hand-carved wooden cross, no bigger than his thumb, with intricate knotwork along its edges. "My sister Mary carved this for me before she died," he said quietly, placing it on the table between them. "She always said it would keep me on the righteous path, help me know right from wrong when the choice wasn't clear." Rosa crossed herself instinctively, recognizing the deep faith the little cross represented. "Your sister was a wise woman." "She was. Raised me after our parents died, kept me from going wild like a lot of boys in our situation." Thatcher's fingers traced the worn wood. "When she passed from the fever 5 years ago, I didn't much care what happened to me. Started drifting, taking jobs that paid well and didn't ask too many questions." "That's how you ended up working for Morrison?" Josie guessed. "That's how I ended up becoming the kind of man Morrison could trust with the truth." Thatcher's voice carried the weight of old regrets. "See, I'd developed a reputation for discretion. Cattle buyers and ranch owners started hiring me to investigate problems they couldn't take to the law there because the law was corrupt or because they needed answers that wouldn't end up in court records." Jake leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. You're saying Morrison wasn't the first to have this problem? Not by a long shot. I'd worked similar cases in 3 other territories over the past 2 years. Always the same pattern: legitimate ranchers losing cattle to forged sales, corrupt officials looking the other way, and anyone who asked too many questions ending up dead or disappeared. How many people are we talking about? Josie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. At least a dozen that I know of, probably more. But here's the thing that makes this different. Thatcher picked up the cross, turning it over in his calloused hands. All the previous cases, the operations were small-scale, local. What Morrison uncovered was bigger. Someone's been coordinating all these smaller networks, building something that spans multiple territories. Rosa muttered something in Spanish that Josie was fairly certain wasn't suitable for polite company. Jake's expression had grown increasingly grim as the implications sank in. "You're talking about organized crime," Jake said flatly. "The kind that has enough money and influence to buy judges and sheriffs. And enough reach to make sure witnesses don't live to testify," Thatcher confirmed. "That's why I've been running instead of trying to clear my name through legal channels. The people behind this have too much invested to let one inconvenient witness bring it all down." Josie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "And now you've brought that here." "I'm sorry," Thatcher said immediately. "I never meant for you to get involved. When I stepped into that trap this morning, I thought I was finally done running. Figured I'd rather die in these woods than spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder." "But you didn't die," Rosa pointed out with practical firmness. "God sent you an angel instead." "I'm no angel," Josie protested, the same words she'd spoken that morning. "No," Thatcher agreed, his blue eyes warm with something that made Josie's heart skip. "You're better than that. You're a woman with the courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. Jake cleared his throat meaningfully, breaking the spell. "Well then," Jake said, "I reckon we'd better figure out how to keep you both safe while we work on proving your innocence. Can't do much good if you're dead." "I won't put this family in danger," Thatcher said firmly, "if staying here means bringing trouble down on your heads." "You let us worry about that," Josie interrupted. "This ranch has weathered everything from Indian raids to drought to cattle wars. We know how to take care of our own." "But I'm not your own," Thatcher pointed out quietly. Rosa snorted dismissively. "You ate at our table. You're our own now, whether you like it or not." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Josie found herself smiling at Rosa's matter-of-fact declaration. The older woman had a way of cutting through complications with simple truths that left little room for argument. "What about the missing cattle?" Jake asked, ever practical. "Were they part of this larger operation?" "Could be," Thatcher admitted. "The timing's suspicious. Whoa, dozen head disappearing right before I show up in the area. Could be someone's trying to make it look like I'm still actively rustling. Or could be they wanted to draw you out into the open," Josie suggested. "Get you away from town, away from witnesses." "That trap wasn't set by accident," Jake agreed grimly. "Someone knew you'd be tracking through those woods." Thatcher nodded slowly. "Which means someone's been watching, waiting for the right moment to spring it. The question is, how long have they known I was in the area?" As if summoned by their worried conversation, Blue appeared at the kitchen door, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his throat. Jake was on his feet instantly, his hand on his gun. "Company coming," he announced tersely. They could all hear it now, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a steady pace. Not the frantic gallop of men in a hurry, but the deliberate advance of people who had all the time in the world and knew exactly where they were going. "How many?" Josie asked, already reaching for her rifle. Jake peered through the window, counting the shadows moving against the moonlit yard. 6, maybe 7, too many to be friendly visitors. Thatcher rose from the table, his entire demeanor shifting from grateful guest to dangerous man. "This is my fault. They followed me here." "Doesn't matter whose fault it is," Josie said firmly. "What matters is what we do about it." Rosa was already moving, gathering the supper dishes with practiced efficiency. She'd lived through enough trouble to know that whatever was coming, they'd face it better with clear surfaces and no unnecessary distractions. "The root cellar," she suggested quietly. "Mr. Thatcher could hide there while—" "No," Thatcher's voice was flat and final. "I won't hide behind women's skirts while good people face danger because of me." Outside, the horses had stopped in the yard. Josie could see dark figures dismounting, spreading out around the house with military precision. These weren't drifters or casual bounty hunters. They moved like men with training and experience. "Miss Calder," a voice called from the darkness, "we know you're harboring a fugitive. Send him out, and nobody has to get hurt." It wasn't Deputy Walsh this time. The voice belonged to someone with authority and the kind of confidence that came from knowing the odds were on his side. Josie looked at Thatcher, seeing in his face the same determination she felt in her own heart. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. "What do you want to do?" she asked quietly. Thatcher picked up the little wooden cross from the table and slipped it back into his vest pocket, right over his heart. "I want to trust that your sister was right about keeping me on the righteous path," he said, "even if it gets us all killed." Outside, the voice called again, with less patience this time. The real test was about to begin. "We're not sending anyone out," Josie called back through the window, her voice carrying across the moonlit yard with quiet authority. "This is private property, and you're trespassing." A harsh laugh echoed from the darkness. "Private property doesn't mean much when you're harboring killers, Miss Calder. We're here on official business." Jake had positioned himself at the front window, his rifle ready. "I count 7, he whispered. "They've got the house surrounded." Thatcher moved to the back window, peering through the curtains at the shadows positioned near the barn and outbuildings. "Professional setup. These aren't local bounty hunters." "Who do you think they are?" Josie asked, checking her own Winchester. "The kind of men who clean up loose ends for people with too much to lose," Thatcher replied grimly. Rosa had finished clearing the table and now stood beside the massive oak sideboard that had belonged to Josie's great-grandmother. Without warning, she began pushing the heavy piece of furniture aside, revealing a small alcove behind it. "Hidden space," she explained quietly. "Samuel built it during the Apache troubles, big enough for one person." "I told you I won't hide," Thatcher began, but Rosa silenced him with a sharp look. "Not for hiding," she said firmly, "for keeping something safe." From the hidden alcove, she withdrew a battered leather pouch, its surface darkened with age. "Your father kept this here," she told Josie. "Said if anything ever happened to him, you'd need what's inside." Josie took the pouch with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of papers within. She'd never seen it before, never known her father had kept secrets in the family home. "Not now," Thatcher said urgently as she started to open it. "First, we deal with our immediate problem." The voice outside called again, closer now. "You've got 1 minute to send Boone out, Miss Calder. After that, we come in and get him ourselves." "Like hell you will," Jake muttered, adjusting his grip on his rifle. Thatcher looked around the kitchen, his tactical mind assessing their situation. 3 defenders in a wooden house against 7 attackers with unknown weapons and military training. The odds weren't encouraging. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "If I can get to the barn without being seen, I could circle around behind them, create enough confusion for you to get clear." "We're not running," Josie said firmly. "Josie." "No." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "I've spent my whole life on this ranch. My father died defending it, and my grandfather before him. I won't be the first Calder to run when trouble comes calling." Something shifted in Thatcher's expression, a recognition of the steel beneath Josie's quiet strength. "Your father raised a remarkable woman." "He raised a stubborn woman," Rosa corrected with grim humor, "just like her mother." The moment was broken by the sound of breaking glass from the front parlor. Someone had thrown something through the window not to enter, but to announce that negotiations were over. "Time's up," the voice called. "We're coming in." Jake moved toward the kitchen door that led to the main house. "I'll hold the front. Rosa, take Josie and get to the root cellar." "I'm not leaving," Josie protested. "And I'm not leaving them," Thatcher added. Rosa threw her hands up in exasperation. "Stubborn, all of you. Fine, we make our stand here, together. But if we die, I'm haunting all of you for eternity." Despite the danger, Josie found herself smiling. Deal. The kitchen door burst open, and the first attacker charged through lean man with cold eyes and a sheriff's badge that Josie didn't recognize. Jake's rifle barked once, and the man spun sideways, clutching his shoulder. "Sheriff's Department!" the wounded man shouted, though his badge looked newly minted and his authority questionable. "You're all under arrest for harboring a fugitive." "Show me a warrant," Jake called back, working the lever of his rifle. More men poured through the front of the house, and the kitchen exploded into chaos. Thatcher grabbed the heavy oak table and overturned it, creating a makeshift barricade. Josie crouched behind it, her Winchester ready, while Rosa disappeared into her pantry and emerged with a double-barreled shotgun that looked like it had seen service in the Civil War. "Samuel taught me to shoot too," she said grimly, breaking open the weapon to check its loads. The first real exchange of gunfire lit up the kitchen like deadly lightning. Josie put a bullet through the doorframe inches from an attacker's head, causing him to dive for cover behind the stove. Jake's rifle spoke again from his position near the window, and another cry of pain echoed from the front room. "You're only making this harder on yourselves," the leader shouted from somewhere in the house. "Surrender now, and we'll make it quick." "Kind offer," Thatcher called back, his voice steady despite the bullets whining overhead. "But we'll pass." In the brief lull that followed, Josie noticed something glinting around Thatcher's neck, a thin silver chain that had worked loose from beneath his shirt collar. Hanging from it was a small, heart-shaped locket, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the locket. Thatcher's hand went instinctively to his throat, tucking the chain back beneath his shirt. "Nothing important, just—" A bullet splintered the wood above their heads, cutting off his explanation. But Josie had seen his expression change, seen the flash of pain that crossed his features at her question. "Not nothing," she said quietly, reloading her rifle with practiced speed. "Tell me." "My sister," Thatcher admitted, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the gun battle. "Her photograph. It's all I have left of her." The simple honesty of his words hit Josie harder than she'd expected. Here was this giant of a man, tough enough to survive months on the run from professional killers, yet he carried his sister's picture next to his heart like a talisman against the darkness of the world. "She'd be proud of you," Josie said, squeezing off another shot at a shadow moving past the window. "Standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." "She'd tell me I was a fool for getting you involved," Thatcher replied, but there was warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. Rosa's shotgun boomed like thunder, and they heard a man curse creatively from the direction of the back door. "Nobody comes into my kitchen uninvited," she announced with satisfaction. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The kitchen filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of burned gunpowder. Furniture splintered under the impact of bullets, and the walls showed the scars of the running battle. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. "Boone," the leader called, "you've cost me 2 good men. This isn't over." They could hear the attackers retreating, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floors of the front rooms. Outside, horses stamped and snorted as the men mounted up. "We'll be back," the voice promised. "Next time, we won't be so polite about it." The sound of hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving behind only the ringing in their ears and the smell of battle. Jake emerged from his position at the front window, favoring his left arm where a bullet had grazed him. "Everyone all right?" he asked, surveying the damage to Rosa's once pristine kitchen. "We're alive," Josie replied, helping Rosa right an overturned chair. "That's more than I expected 10 minutes ago." Thatcher was examining the bullet holes in the walls, his expression thoughtful. "They weren't trying to kill us," he said finally. "Could have fooled me," Jake muttered, binding his wounded arm with a kitchen towel. "Think about it. 7 armed men against 3-4 if you count Rosaine a wooden house. If they'd wanted us dead, we'd be dead. Thatcher turned to face them, his blue eyes serious. This was a warning. They wanted to show us what they could do, make us understand the consequences of protecting me. Well, Josie said, reloading her rifle with steady hands, I hope they understand the consequences of threatening my family. As she spoke, she realized the truth of her words. Somewhere between finding Thatcher hanging from that tree and standing beside him in a gun battle, he'd become more than just a stranger she was helping. He'd become someone worth fighting for, someone who made her laugh and think and feel things she'd thought she'd given up on. The question was whether they'd both live long enough to explore what that might mean. Outside, Blue began barking again, but this time his tone was different, welcoming rather than warning. More riders were approaching, but these were friends. That'll be Charlie and Louis, Jake said, recognizing the distinctive rhythm of their horses' hoofbeats. They must have heard the shooting. As the ranch hands rode into the yard, calling out to make sure everyone was safe, Josie found herself looking at Thatcher with new eyes. The locket resting against his heart, the wooden cross in his vest pocket, the way he'd stood ready to die rather than let harm come to people who'd shown him kindness. All of it painted a picture of a man worth believing in. The only question now was whether believing would be enough to keep them all alive. Dawn broke grey and somber over the Double C ranch, revealing the full extent of the previous night's damage. Bullet holes pocked the kitchen walls like deadly freckles, and Rosa's prized china cabinet bore the scars of the gun battle. But it was the blood-stained bandana that Thatcher found tucked behind the overturned stove that truly caught everyone's attention. This doesn't belong to any of us, Josie said, examining the faded blue fabric. The bandana was old, well-worn, and bore the distinctive smell of tobacco and leather that spoke of long trails and hard living. Jake peered over her shoulder, his wounded arm bound in a proper sling now that Charlie had fetched the medical supplies from the barn. One of the attackers must have dropped it in the confusion. Thatcher took the bandana, studying it with the intensity of a man who'd learned to read stories in the smallest details. There's something else, he said quietly, pointing to a dark stain along one edge. This isn't fresh blood. It's old, set deep into the fabric. How old? Josie asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Hard to say for certain, but if I had to guess. Thatcher held the fabric up to the morning light, examining the way the stain had spread and faded. Months, maybe longer. This came from a serious wound, the kind that bleeds heavy and doesn't stop easy. Rosa crossed herself instinctively. You think it's from the Morrison killing? Could be, or one of the other murders connected to this cattle ring. Thatcher folded the bandana carefully, treating it like the evidence it might prove to be. Either way, it's not something a careful man would leave behind by accident. Charlie Winters, who'd been unusually quiet since arriving to find the ranch shot up, finally spoke. Maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe someone wanted us to find it. All eyes turned to the youngest of the ranch hands, a 23-year-old cowboy who was better with horses than he was with words. Charlie rarely offered opinions on anything more complicated than the weather, which made his observation all the more significant. What do you mean? Josie asked. Charlie shifted uncomfortably under their collective attention. Well, Miss Josie, I've been thinking about what happened last night. 7 armed men, professional-like, and they didn't manage to kill anybody? Jake's right. They weren't trying real hard to put us in the ground. So you think they left this on purpose? Thatcher held up the bandana. Maybe, or maybe someone else did. Charlie's young face was serious beyond his years. Someone who wanted us to have evidence but couldn't risk being seen giving it to us directly. The implications of Charlie's theory settled over the group like morning fog. If he was right, it meant they had an ally somewhere in the enemy camp, someone willing to take enormous risks to help prove Thatcher's innocence. We need to get this to someone who can examine it properly, Josie said, taking charge as she always did when situations grew complicated. Someone with the knowledge and equipment to tell us what we're really looking at. Doc Henley in town might be able to help, Louis suggested. He's got that fancy microscope he ordered from back east, uses it to look at blood samples and such. Jake shook his head grimly. Doc Henley's a good man, but he's also cautious. Soon as we walk into town with a wanted man and ask him to examine evidence from a crime scene, he'll feel duty-bound to notify the authorities." "Which authorities?" Thatcher asked pointedly. "The honest ones, or the ones trying to kill us?" It was a fair question, and one that highlighted their precarious position. In a territory where corruption ran deep and badges could be bought, knowing who to trust became a matter of life and death. "There might be another option," Josie said slowly, remembering something her father had mentioned years ago. "Doc Henley isn't the only one in the territory with medical training. There's a woman about 30 miles north of here, Sarah Mitchell. Used to be an army surgeon before she retired to a small practice. My father said she was the best combat medic he'd ever seen." "Combat medic would know about blood evidence," Thatcher agreed. "Question is, can we trust her?" "Only one way to find out," Josie replied, but her tone suggested she'd already made up her mind. Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway, surveying the damage with a housekeeper's eye for detail. "Before anyone goes anywhere, you need to eat," she announced with characteristic authority. "Can't fight a war on empty stomachs." As Rosa began preparing breakfast around the bullet holes and overturned furniture, Jake pulled Thatcher aside for a private conversation. Josie watched them from the corner of her eye, noting the serious expressions and hushed tones that suggested important matters were being discussed. "What do you really think our chances are?" Jake asked quietly. Thatcher was silent for a long moment, staring out at the morning landscape where everything looked peaceful and normal, despite the violence that had visited them in the darkness. "Honestly, if we play this straight, try to work within the system, we're all dead within a week. These people have too much money and influence to let us survive as witnesses. And if we don't play it straight, then we're outlaws, same as they are. But at least we'd be outlaws with a chance of living long enough to prove the truth." Jake nodded slowly, understanding the choice they faced. "Miss Josie's not going to like hearing that. Miss Josie's going to have to face reality," Thatcher replied. "This isn't a fairy tale where right always wins over might. Sometimes good people have to do questionable things to survive long enough to do the right thing." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, this one announced by Blue's welcoming bark rather than his warning growl. A lone rider approached the ranch house, moving slowly with his hands clearly visible. As he drew closer, they could see it was Tom Brady, the owner of the neighboring Lazy Bee Ranch and one of Samuel Calder's oldest friends. Tom was a man in his 60s, weathered by decades of hard ranch work, but still straight-backed and clear-eyed. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested the cold morning air, and approached the group with obvious concern. "Heard there was trouble out here last night," he said without preamble. "Came to see if you folks needed help." "Thank you, Tom," Josie replied warmly. "We're all right, mostly. How much have you heard?" "Enough to know you're harboring a wanted man and that someone shot up your kitchen over it." Tom's weathered face was grave. "Also heard that Deputy Walsh is telling anyone who'll listen that Thatcher Boone is a cold-blooded killer who seduced you into helping him." Josie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but it was anger rather than embarrassment. "Is that what people believe?" "Some do. Others remember what kind of man your father was and figure his daughter wouldn't be taken in by a smooth-talking desperado." Tom's eyes found Thatcher, studying him with the measuring gaze of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "Question is, which one of them is right?" Thatcher met the older man's stare steadily. "I didn't kill William Morrison, Mr. Brady, but I understand why you'd have doubts." "Actually, I don't," Tom replied, surprising them all. "See, I knew Bill Morrison, worked with him on several cattle drives back in the day. He wasn't the kind of man who'd hire a killer to investigate cattle theft. If he trusted you, that's good enough for me." The simple statement of faith seemed to lift a weight from Thatcher's shoulders. Here was validation from someone who'd known Morrison personally, someone whose opinion carried weight in the community. "What's the mood in town?" Jake asked. Tom's expression grew troubled. "Mixed. The sheriff's officially staying neutral, says it's a matter for the territorial authorities. But Walsh has been stirring up sentiment, claiming that harboring Boone puts the whole community at risk. Some folks are scared, others are angry. It's the kind of situation that could turn ugly fast. Meaning there's talk of forming a vigilante committee. Walsh is encouraging it, saying the law's too slow and the threat's too immediate to wait for proper justice. Tom's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd seen what happened when communities took justice into their own hands. If they decide to ride out here in force, you won't be able to fight them all off. The bandana in Thatcher's pocket suddenly felt heavier, its potential significance magnified by the urgency of their situation. They needed proof of his innocence, and they needed it fast, before fear and manipulation turned their neighbors into enemies. "How long do you think we have?" Josie asked. "Day or two at most. Walsh is pushing hard, and scared people don't think clearly." Tom looked around at the bullet-damaged ranch buildings, assessing their defensive capabilities with a soldier's eye. "You need to either prove his innocence quick or get him somewhere safe until you can." "We're working on the first option," Thatcher said, patting his pocket where the blood-stained bandana rested. "Good, but have a backup plan ready, just in case." Tom remounted his horse, settling into the saddle with a grunt of effort. "I'll do what I can to slow things down in town, talk to the reasonable folks about giving you time to sort this out properly." But Tom Brady's word only carries so much weight these days. As Tom rode away, the group stood in somber silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the narrowing window of opportunity they faced. The bandana might provide the evidence they needed to clear Thatcher's name, but only if they could get it examined and verified before the vigilantes arrived. "We need to ride to see Sarah Mitchell today," Josie decided. "This evidence won't do us any good if we're all dead before we can use it." "Agreed," Thatcher said, "but not all of us should go. If this is a trap, we don't want everyone caught in it." "I'll go with you," Jake volunteered immediately. "No," Josie said firmly. "You're hurt, and someone needs to stay here to coordinate the defense if those vigilantes show up early. Charlie and Louis can handle that with Rosa's help, but they'll need an experienced hand to guide them." Jake started to protest, but Josie cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. "Besides, Sarah Mitchell is more likely to trust another woman than a group of armed men showing up at her door." "She's right," Thatcher admitted reluctantly, "but I don't like the idea of you taking that risk." "It's my risk to take," Josie replied, "and my decision to make." As they prepared for the dangerous journey ahead, none of them noticed the lone figure watching from the ridge above the ranch, someone who'd been observing their movements since before dawn, someone who had plans of their own for the blood-stained bandana and the secrets it might reveal. The ride to Dr. Sarah Mitchell's place took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country in the territory. Josie and Thatcher followed deer trails and creek beds, avoiding the main roads where vigilantes or Walsh's men might be watching. Copper and Thatcher's borrowed mount, a steady bay gelding named Buck, picked their way carefully across rocky slopes and through dense stands of pine and aspen. They'd been riding for 2 hours when Thatcher called for a halt near a natural spring hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. As the horses drank, he reached into his saddlebags and withdrew something wrapped in oiled clother, broken spur, its rowel bent and one of its decorative conchos missing. "Found this caught in the fence wire near where your cattle went missing," he said, unwrapping the piece of hardware carefully. "Didn't want to mention it in front of the others until I was sure what it meant." Josie examined the spur with growing excitement. It was distinctive work, Spanish silver, with intricate engraving that spoke of Mexico or the deep Southwest. More importantly, it wasn't the kind of equipment any of the local ranchers would wear. "This doesn't belong to anyone from around here," she said with certainty. "My father taught me to recognize every brand and every style of tack in 3 counties. This is from somewhere else entirely." "That's what I was thinking. Question is, did it come from whoever drove off your cattle or from someone who was tracking them?" Thatcher rewrapped the spur carefully. "Either way, it's another piece of evidence that doesn't match the story Walsh is telling." As they prepared to resume their journey, Josie found herself studying Thatcher's profile in the dappled sunlight. The strong jaw, the laugh lines around his eyes, The way he sat his horse like a man born to the saddle, everything about him spoke of competence and quiet strength. Yet there was a gentleness in the way he handled the horses, a consideration in how he helped her navigate difficult terrain, that revealed the character beneath the capable exterior. "Tell me about your sister," she said as they rode deeper into the wilderness. Thatcher was quiet for so long that Josie began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and cherished memories. "Mary was 7 years older than me, but she never made me feel like a burden after our parents died. She worked 3 jobs to keep us fed and took in laundry, cleaned houses, even worked in the saloon serving drinks when times got really hard." His hand went instinctively to the locket at his throat. "Never complained, never made me feel guilty for being another mouth to feed." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Smart as a whip too. Taught herself to read and write when most girls in our situation wouldn't have had the chance. Always said education was the key to a better life, that knowledge was the one thing nobody could take away from you. Josie thought about her own education, the governesses her father had hired, the books that filled the ranch house library, the opportunities she'd taken for granted. "Is that why you learned to investigate?" For her? Partly. But also because she always believed people deserved justice, even when the law wasn't interested in providing it. She used to say that if good people didn't stand up for what was right, then evil people would win by default. They crested a ridge and saw Dr. Mitchell's homestead spread out in the valley, below a neat collection of buildings including a house, barn, and what appeared to be a medical clinic. Smoke rose from the chimney, and they could see a woman working in a vegetable garden beside the house. "Looks peaceful enough," Thatcher observed, but his hand rested on his gun butt as he scanned the surrounding terrain for signs of trouble. As they rode into the yard, the woman in the garden straightened and turned to face them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a woman of perhaps 45, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of steady gaze that came from seeing too much of life's harsh realities. She wore practical clothesa split-riding skirt and cotton blouse, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with tools as well as medicines. "Good afternoon," she called, setting down her hoe and approaching them with cautious interest. "I'm Dr. Mitchell. What brings you to my little corner of nowhere?" Josie dismounted and extended her hand in greeting. "I'm Josie Calder from the Double C Ranch. This is Thatcher Boone. We're hoping you might be able to help us with a medical question." Dr. Mitchell's expression sharpened at Thatcher's name. "The wanted man. I've heard about you." "I'm sure you have," Thatcher replied evenly. "Question is, what did you hear? And from whom?" "Heard you were wanted for murder and cattle rustling. Heard there was a substantial reward for your capture, dead or alive." Dr. Mitchell studied him with clinical interest. "Also heard that Deputy Walsh was mighty eager to spread that information around." "And what do you think about what you heard?" Josie asked. Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, her physician's eyes taking in details that others might miss the way Thatcher held himself, the quality of his clothes, the condition of his horse and equipment. Finally, she smiled. "I think Deputy Walsh is a lying snake who couldn't tell the truth if his life depended on it," she said bluntly. "I also think that if you were really a cold-blooded killer, you wouldn't be riding openly through the countryside with a respectable young woman. You'd either be hiding out somewhere safe, or you'd have done something terrible to Miss Calder already." "Thank you," Thatcher said simply. "Don't thank me yet. What kind of medical question did you want to ask?" Josie produced the blood-stained bandana from her saddlebags. "We need to know what you can tell us about this blood. How old it is, what kind of wound it came from, anything that might help us understand where it originated." Dr. Mitchell took the fabric with practiced care, holding it up to the light and examining the stain with obvious expertise. "This is definitely human blood, and it's been here for some time. Several months, I'd estimate. The pattern suggests a deep laceration, probably to the arm or shoulder area, that bled heavily for an extended period." "Could someone survive a wound that bled this much?" Thatcher asked. "Possibly with proper medical treatment, but it would have left a significant scar and the person would have been incapacitated for weeks during recovery." Dr. Mitchell folded the bandana carefully. "May I ask where you found this?" Josie explained about the attack on the ranch and their discovery of the evidence, while Dr. Mitchell listened with growing interest and concern. "Someone left this deliberately," the doctor concluded when Josie finished. "In my experience, men don't carry around blood-stained bandanas unless they have a specific reason for keeping them." "What kind of reason?" Thatcher asked. "Trophy, reminder, or evidence they plan to use someday." Dr. Mitchell's expression grew grave. "Whatever the case, this belonged to someone who was seriously wounded months ago. If you can find the man with the matching scar, you might find your answers." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Mitchell caught Josie's arm. "Be careful," she warned quietly. "I've treated men who've tangled with Walsh and his associates before. The ones who lived long enough to reach me anyway. They don't leave witnesses, and they don't forgive people who cross them." "We'll be careful," Josie promised. "See that you are, and Miss Calder, your father, was a good man who raised a brave daughter. Don't let that courage get you killed over a man you barely know." As they rode away from the homestead, Josie found herself thinking about Dr. Mitchell's warning. The physician was right that she barely knew Thatcher Boone, had met him only yesterday under the most unusual circumstances. Yet somehow, in the space of 24 hours, he'd become important to her in ways she didn't fully understand. Maybe it was the way he'd made her laugh while hanging upside down from a tree. Maybe it was his willingness to surrender rather than put her in danger, or the gentle way he spoke about his dead sister, or how he'd stood ready to fight impossible odds to protect people who'd shown him kindness. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was the way he looked at her not as a woman to be protected or possessed, but as an equal worthy of respect and partnership. In a world where men too often saw women as ornaments or burdens, Thatcher Boone saw her as herself. The ride back to the Double C would take them through increasingly dangerous territory as word of their mission spread. But with the blood-stained bandana safely tucked away and Dr. Mitchell's expert analysis to support their case, they finally had real evidence that might prove Thatcher's innocence. The question was whether they'd live long enough to use it. Behind them, hidden in the trees above Dr. Mitchell's homestead, a lone rider watched their departure through field glasses. Deputy Walsh's pale eyes glittered with satisfaction as he observed the direction they took, already planning how to use this information to his advantage. The net was closing, and soon there would be nowhere left to run. They were 3 miles from the Double C when the ambush struck. Thatcher saw the glint of sunlight on metal an instant before the rifle cracked, and his combat instincts saved both their lives. He launched himself from Buck's saddle, tackling Josie and dragging her from Copper's back, just as a second shot whined through the space where her head had been. They hit the ground hard, rolling behind a cluster of boulders as more shots erupted from the ridge above. Copper and Buck bolted, their reins trailing, leaving Josie and Thatcher pinned down in the open with limited cover and no way to retreat. "How many?" Josie gasped, checking her rifle and counting the cartridges in her belt. "At least 4, maybe more," Thatcher replied, peering around the edge of their rocky shelter. "Professional positioning. They've been waiting for us." A new voice called from the heights, not Deputy Walsh this time, but someone with authority and the crisp diction of an educated man. "Miss Calder! Mr. Boone!" "I'm Colonel Marcus Reed, Territorial Marshal. You're surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll live to see trial." "Never heard of any Colonel Reed," Josie whispered. "Neither have I," Thatcher replied grimly. "But that doesn't mean much. Half the badges in this territory are for sale to the highest bidder." "What do you want?" Josie called back. "Justice, Miss Calder. Thatcher Boone is a wanted man, and you're interfering with the lawful execution of my duties by harboring him." "Lawful?" Thatcher's voice carried clearly across the rocky terrain. "Is that what you call setting traps for unarmed men, attacking ranches in the middle of the night?" Reed's laughter was cold and professional. "I don't know what you're talking about, Boone. I'm here on official business with proper warrants and territorial authority." That's when Josie saw it, a piece of yellow paper, fluttering from behind a rock, outcropping where it had apparently fallen or been dropped by one of Reed's men. Even from a distance, she could see the distinctive layout and typeface of a telegraph message. "Cover me," she whispered to Thatcher. "What are you doing?" "Getting evidence." Before he could stop her, Josie darted from their shelter, zigzagging toward the paper as bullets whined around her. She snatched it up and dove back to safety, her heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. The telegraph was addressed to Deputy Walsh and dated 3 days earlier, the day before Thatcher had been found in the trap. As Josie read its contents, her blood turned to ice. "Walsh, stop, Boone confirmed in your area. Stop, eliminate him, and any witnesses. Stop, make it look like resistance during lawful arrest. Stop, cattle operation must not be exposed. Stop, read." "Thatcher," she said quietly, handing him the message. "Look at this." His face went white as he read. "They've been planning this from the beginning. The trap, the attack on your ranch, everything. We were never meant to survive this." "What cattle operation?" Josie asked, her mind racing through the implications. "That's the real question, isn't it?" Thatcher folded the telegraph carefully, tucking it into his vest pocket next to his sister's cross. "This isn't just about framing me for Morrison's murder. There's something bigger going on, something worth killing half the territory to protect." Another voice joined the conversation, from the Ridge Deputy Walsh, his tone smug with anticipated victory. "Getting cozy down there, are we? Don't get too comfortable. We've got all day, and you've got nowhere to run." "Actually," a new voice interrupted, "I think they do." The shots from above stopped abruptly, replaced by sounds of confusion and conflict. Someone was attacking Reed's men from behind, catching the ambushes in their own trap. "Jake," Josie called hopefully. "Not Jake," came the reply as a lone figure appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. "Name's Ben Morrison. Bill was my brother." Josie felt her heart skip as she recognized the family resemblance. Ben Morrison was younger than his murdered brother had been, maybe 35, with the lean build of a professional tracker and the steady hands of someone comfortable with violence when necessary. "How did you find us?" Thatcher called. "Been tracking you for weeks," Ben replied, working his way down the slope with his rifle ready. "Same as them, but for different reasons. I want to know who really killed Bill, and you're the only man who might have answers." Reed's voice cut through the confusion, tight with anger and fear. "Morrison, you're interfering with official territorial business." "Official business, my ass," Ben shot back. "I know what you are, Reed. You and Walsh and the whole corrupt network you represent. My brother died because he got too close to your cattle operation, and you framed Boone here to cover your tracks." The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than anything Josie had imagined. This wasn't just about cattle rustling or even murder, it was about systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "What cattle operation?" she called to Ben. "The one that's been stealing livestock across 4 territories and selling them through forged bills of sale," Ben replied, keeping his rifle trained on the ridge where Reed's men were regrouping. "The one that uses territorial marshals and deputies to eliminate anyone who gets too close to the truth." "How do you know all this?" "Because Bill wasn't the only rancher asking questions. There've been at least a dozen suspicious deaths in the past 2 years, all honest men who started investigating missing cattle and ended up dead or disappeared." Ben's voice carried the weight of months of careful investigation. "I've been tracking the pattern, following the money, building a case." "Then why didn't you turn it over to the authorities?" Thatcher asked. Ben's bitter laughter echoed off the rocks. "What authorities? Reed there has territorial jurisdiction. Walsh controls 3 counties. The cattle buyers they work with have judges and sheriffs in their pockets from here to Denver. There is no law when the law itself is corrupt." A rifle shot from the ridge emphasized his point, followed by Reed's furious voice. "Enough talking. Kill them all. We can't afford to leave witnesses." The battle resumed with renewed intensity, but now the odds were more even. Ben Morrison fought with the skill of a man who'd spent months preparing for this moment, while Thatcher's military training gave him tactical advantages the corrupt lawmen hadn't expected. Josie found herself in the middle of a three-way gun battle that would determine not just their survival, but the fate of an entire territory. The telegraph in Thatcher's pocket proved the conspiracy existed, but only if they lived long enough to present it to someone with the power and integrity to act on it. As the afternoon wore on and ammunition ran low, it became clear that something had to change. They couldn't hold their position indefinitely, and Reed's men had them outgunned and outnumbered. That's when Josie remembered the leather pouch Rosa had given her, the one her father had hidden behind the kitchen sideboard. In all the excitement, she'd forgotten about it completely. "Thatcher," she said during a brief lull in the shooting, "that pouch Rosa gave me, what if it contains something important, something my father knew but never had the chance to use?" "Only one way to find out," he replied, providing cover while she opened the weathered leather. Inside were documents that made her gasp in recognition and dismay. Bills of sale bearing her father's forged signature, transport receipts for cattle that had never left Double C land, and at the bottom, a letter in her father's own handwriting. "If anything happens to me, these forgeries prove that someone has been using the Double C ranch as a front for cattle theft. I've been investigating quietly, but I fear I've been discovered. The operation reaches into the territorial government itself. Trust no one in official authority. Find Benjamin Morrison, he's asking the same questions I am." The letter was dated 3 days before her father's fatal heart attack, an attack that now seemed far less natural than it had at the time. "They killed your father too," Thatcher said quietly, reading over her shoulder. "My father, Bill Morrison, and how many others?" Josie's voice shook with rage and grief. "How many good men died to protect their dirty money?" "Too many," Ben Morrison called from his position on the slope, "but maybe not in vain, if we can get this evidence to someone who'll act on it." Reed's voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "Walsh, take half the men and circle around behind them. We end this now." The final assault was beginning, and despite their evidence and their righteous cause, Josie wasn't sure they'd live to see justice done. But as she looked at Thatcher's determined face, at Ben Morrison's courage in the face of impossible odds, she knew they'd made the right choice. Sometimes the only way to serve justice was to risk everything for the truth, even when the law itself had become the enemy. Her father had understood that when he began his quiet investigation. Bill Morrison had understood it when he hired Thatcher to find answers. Now it was their turn to carry on that legacy, whatever the cost. The forged telegraph fluttered in the mountain breeze, a piece of yellow paper that held the power to bring down a criminal empire if they could survive the next hour to use it. The standoff stretched through the remainder of the afternoon, with both sides conserving ammunition and waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Josie found herself pressed against Thatcher's shoulder behind their rocky shelter, drawing comfort from his steady presence, even as their situation grew increasingly desperate. "We can't stay here much longer," Ben Morrison called softly from his position upslope. "They'll have reinforcements coming, and once it gets dark, they'll be able to move on us without being seen." Thatcher was examining his father's antique rifle lever-action Winchester that had served the Calder family for 2 generations. The weapon was reliable and accurate, perfectly maintained despite its age, and it carried the weight of family history in its worn wooden stock. "This was your father's?" he asked, running his fingers along the brass receiver. "And his father's before him," Josie replied. "Granddad carried it through the Indian Wars, and my father used it to defend the ranch more times than I can count. He always said it was the most trustworthy thing he owned, after his family." "Seems fitting that it should help us finish what he started," Thatcher said, checking the action and sighting down the barrel. From the ridge above, Reed's voice carried with military authority. "Walsh, status report." "They're pinned down good, Colonel," Walsh replied. "Morrison's causing problems, but we can handle him. Give me another hour, and this'll all be over." "An hour's too long. The sun's getting low, and I want this finished before dark." Reed's tone carried the frustration of a man accustomed to quick, decisive action. "Take 3 men and work around to the north. I'll take the others and circle south." We'll catch them in a crossfire they can't survive. Josie felt Thatcher tense beside her. That's what I'd do in their position, he admitted quietly. Classic pincer movement. They'll have us caught between two fires with no way out. Then we need to move first, Ben Morrison said, having overheard the exchange. Break out of this trap before they can spring theirs. Move where? Josie asked. They've got the high ground, and we're on foot in open country. Not all of it's open, Ben replied, pointing toward a narrow draw that cut between two ridgelines about 200 yards to their east. That ravine runs for nearly a mile before it opens onto the main trail. If we can reach it, we might have a chance. Thatcher studied the terrain with a tactical eye, measuring distances and calculating odds. It's a long run across open ground. They'll have clear shots at us for most of the way. Better than sitting here waiting to die, Josie said firmly, surprised by her own resolve. The lady's got a point, Ben agreed. Besides, they're expecting us to stay put and fight defensively. A breakout might catch them off guard. As they planned their desperate escape attempt, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the valley below. All three of them froze, expecting to see Reed's reinforcements arriving to seal their fate. Instead, they saw a sight that filled Josie's heart with hope and dread in equal measure. Jake Morrison rode into view at the head of a group that included Charlie, Luis, and 4 other men from neighboring ranches. They were armed and determined, riding hard toward the sound of gunfire that had been echoing across the countryside for hours. "Jake, no," Josie called out, but her voice was lost in the distance. Reed had seen them too. "Walsh, new targets approaching from the south. Deal with them." The corrupt marshal's cold calculation was evident as he split his forces to meet this new threat. Half his men remained focused on the trapped trio, while the others repositioned to ambush Jake's rescue party before they could reach the battle. "They're riding into a trap," Thatcher said grimly, watching Jake's group approach the valley where Reed's men lay in wait. "We have to warn them," Josie insisted, but Ben Morrison shook his head. "Too far, and they'd never hear us over the sound of their own horses. By the time our voices carry, it'll be too late." That's when Josie remembered something her father had taught her as a childer trick he'd learned from Apache scouts during his younger days. She pulled off her light-colored shawl and began waving it in a specific pattern against the dark rocks, creating a visual signal that stood out against the natural background. "What are you doing?" Thatcher asked. "Apache mirror, talk, adapted for cloth," she replied, continuing the rhythmic pattern. "My father said the key was to create a signal distinct enough to catch attention, but simple enough to understand quickly." For a moment, it seemed her efforts were in vain. Jake's group continued their headlong rush toward danger, unaware of the ambush waiting for them. Then Luis, riding at Jake's right hand, suddenly pointed in their direction and called out something that made the entire group rein in their horses. Jake raised a pair of field glasses, studying the ridge where Reed's men were positioned. Even at that distance, Josie could see him counting muzzle flashes and assessing the tactical situation with the eye of an experienced fighter. Instead of charging into the trap, Jake's group split up, some taking cover, while others worked around to flank Reed's ambush positions. The corrupt marshal's advantage of surprise evaporated as his carefully laid plans crumbled under the assault of men who knew the country and weren't afraid to fight for what was right. "Smart man, that foreman of yours," Ben observed with approval. "He's got good tactical instincts." The arrival of Jake's reinforcements had changed the entire dynamic of the battle. Reed's men, who had moments before held every advantage, now found themselves caught between multiple forces and fighting a battle on several fronts simultaneously. "This is our chance," Thatcher said, checking his ammunition. "While they're distracted dealing with Jake's group, we make our move for that ravine." "All of us?" Josie asked. "No," Ben Morrison replied firmly. "Someone needs to stay behind and keep their attention focused here. Draw their fire while the others escape." The implication was clear: whoever stayed would likely die, buying time for the others to reach safety. Josie saw the resolve in Ben's eyes and knew he'd already made his choice. "It should be me," Thatcher said quietly. This whole thing started because they're after me. No reason for anyone else to die over it. Like hell, Ben shot back. My brother's killer is up there on that ridge. I'm not leaving until I've settled that account. Then we all go together or we all stay together, Josie declared with finality that surprised even her. I've lost too many people I care about to start abandoning them now. Thatcher turned to look at her fully, something shifting in his expression. People you care about? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities neither had dared to voice before. Despite everything, the violence, the danger, the uncertainty about their survival, Josie found herself speaking from the heart. Yes, she said simply, I care about you, Thatcher Boone, more than I probably should, considering I've known you less than 2 days. 2 days, he repeated wonderingly, feels like a lifetime. Or the beginning of one, she replied, then immediately felt heat rise in her cheeks at her own boldness. Miss Calder, Thatcher said formally, though his eyes were warm with something that made her pulse quicken, when this is over, if we survive this, I'd like very much to court you properly. With your permission, of course. When this is over, she agreed. I'd like that too. Ben Morrison made a sound that might have been laughter or exasperation. Folks, I hate to interrupt this touching moment, but we've still got professional killers trying to murder us. Maybe save the romance for later? A rifle bullet spanging off their rocky shelter emphasized his point, followed by Reed's voice calling from above. Boone, I'm losing patience with this game. Surrender now, and I'll make sure Miss Calder lives long enough to testify at your trial. Generous offer, Thatcher called back, but I think I'll pass. The battle below had intensified as Jake's men engaged Reed's ambush party in a running fight across the valley floor. Josie could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars in the gathering dusk, could hear the shouts of men and the screaming of wounded horses. Her friends and neighbors were risking their lives for her and Thatcher, and the weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. We need to end this, she said quietly. Jake's people are good men, but they're not professional fighters. The longer this goes on, the more of them are going to die. I'm open to suggestions, Ben replied, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. That's when Josie noticed something that made her heart leap with possibility. The horses, she said, pointing to where Copper and Buck had taken shelter in a grove of aspens about 50 yards away. They're not as far off as I thought. Still too far to reach without getting shot, Thatcher pointed out. Maybe, but what if we created enough confusion to give ourselves a chance? Josie was thinking fast now, remembering every story her father had told about fighting with limited resources against superior odds. Ben, how much powder do you have left? About half a pound. Why? Enough to make some noise if we set it off all at once. Ben's eyes lit up with understanding. You want to create a diversion, get them looking the wrong way while we make a break for it. Something like that. Josie was already moving, gathering small rocks and dry branches. Help me build a little fort here, something that looks like we're settling in for a long siege. Then we set the powder charge behind it, light a long fuse, and start running. They'll figure out it's a trick pretty quickly, Thatcher warned. Doesn't matter, as long as it buys us enough time to reach the horses and get clear of their rifle range. Ben was already working, building a small fortress of stones and branches that would look convincing from the ridge above. This might actually work. The explosion will sound like we're throwing everything we have at them, make them think we're starting a final desperate assault. While we're actually running in the opposite direction, Thatcher finished, beginning to see the logic of the plan. Risky, but better odds than we have sitting here. As they worked, the sound of the battle below began to change. Jake's men were holding their own, but ammunition was clearly running low on both sides. The rapid crack of rifle fire had slowed to occasional, carefully aimed shots as both groups conserved their remaining cartridges. Almost ready, Ben announced, arranging the last of the gunpowder in a small hollow behind their decoy position. This should make enough noise to wake the dead when it goes off. Let's hope it doesn't wake us among them, Josie murmured, tearing a strip from her petticoat to serve as a fuse. "Miss Calder," Thatcher said as they prepared for their desperate gamble, "I want you to know whatever happens in the next few minutes, meeting you has been the best thing that's happened to me in years." "Don't talk like we're going to die," she replied firmly. "We're going to get out of this, all of us. We're going to present our evidence to someone who'll listen, and we're going to see justice done for your sister and my father and Bill Morrison and all the other good people these criminals have hurt." "Yes, ma'am," Thatcher agreed, but his smile carried the bittersweet quality of a man who'd learned not to count on happy endings. Ben struck a match and lit the improvised fuse, which began burning with a steady, ominous glow. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before this goes off," he announced. "Once it does, we run like hell and don't look back." As they crouched behind their rocky shelter, waiting for the moment that would determine their fate, Josie found herself thinking about the antique rifle in her hands. 3 generations of Calder men had carried this weapon in defense of home and family, and now it fell to her to continue that tradition. Her father had always said the rifle was more than just a tool, it was a symbol of the responsibility each generation bore to protect what mattered most. Tonight, what mattered most wasn't just her own life, or even Thatcher's, but the principle that justice should triumph over corruption, that good people shouldn't have to live in fear of those who were supposed to protect them. The fuse burned shorter, its glow growing more intense as it approached the cache of gunpowder. In moments, their fate would be decided, freedom or death, justice or the continued triumph of evil men who thought their badges gave them the right to murder with impunity. "Ready?" Ben whispered. "Ready," Josie and Thatcher replied in unison. The world was about to explode around them, and somehow, despite everything, Josie found herself smiling. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, and that made all the difference in the world. The explosion shattered the mountain silence like thunder from a clear sky. Ben's carefully placed powder charge went off with a roar that echoed off the surrounding peaks, sending dirt and rock fragments flying in all directions. The decoy position erupted in flame and smoke, creating exactly the kind of spectacular diversion they'd hoped for. "Now!" Thatcher shouted, and they were running. The 50 yards to the aspen grove stretched like miles as they sprinted across the open ground. Behind them, confused shouts erupted from Reed's positions as the corrupt marshal's men tried to understand what was happening through the smoke and chaos. Josie's legs pumped with desperate strength, her father's rifle clutched tight in her hands. Beside her, Thatcher and Ben ran with the fluid grace of men accustomed to violence, their weapons ready for the fight they knew was coming. They'd covered perhaps half the distance when the first rifle cracked from the ridge above. The bullet whined past Josie's ear, close enough to ruffle her hair, followed immediately by the deeper boom of a smoking revolver that appeared in Thatcher's hand as if by magic. The weapon in his grip wasn't just any gunite, was a Colt .45 Peacemaker with a bone grip, its metal polished to a mirror shine that reflected the last rays of the setting sun. The revolver spoke with authority, its bullet finding one of Reed's men and spinning him around in a deadly pirouette. "Where did that come from?" Josie gasped as they reached the temporary shelter of the aspens. "Sister's wedding gift," Thatcher replied grimly, checking his remaining ammunition. "She saved for 2 years to buy it, said every man needed something reliable to depend on when times got hard." More shots erupted from above as Reed's men recovered from their confusion and began targeting the grove. Bark exploded from the aspen trunks as bullets searched for flesh, and the air filled with the deadly whine of ricochets. "The horses!" Ben shouted, pointing to where Copper and Buck stood wide-eyed, but still manageable among the trees. They reached the animals just as Reed's voice bellowed across the battlefield. "Don't let them reach those horses, kill them now." Josie swung into Copper's saddle with practiced ease, while Thatcher mounted Buck with the fluid motion of a born horseman. Ben had to catch his borrowed mount, a skittish mare that had wandered farther into the grove, but managed to get aboard just as the concentrated fire from above reached deadly intensity. "Ride!" Thatcher commanded, spurring Buck toward the narrow draw that represented their only hope of escape. They burst from the aspens in a thunder of hoofbeats, bent low over their horses' necks as bullets sang through the air around them. The draw Ben had spotted was still 100 yards away, across ground that offered no cover and little hope. Josie felt Copper stretch out beneath her, the Mustang's powerful legs eating up the distance with magnificent courage. Her father's rifle balanced across the saddle, ready for use, but temporarily useless while she concentrated on staying mounted and alive. That's when she saw him, Deputy Walsh, positioned on an outcropping that commanded the entrance to the draw. His rifle was already aimed, his pale eyes sighting down the barrel at Thatcher's broad back. The corrupt lawman's finger was tightening on the trigger when Josie made a decision that changed everything. Without thinking, without calculating odds or consequences, she jerked Copper's reins hard to the left and drove the Mustang directly at Walsh's position. The smoking revolver in her hand when, had she drawn it, bucked twice, its bullets chipping stone from the outcropping and forcing the deputy to duck for cover. "Josie, no!" Thatcher's voice carried desperation and fear, but she was already committed to her course. Walsh's rifle swung toward her, and for a moment she looked directly into the muzzle that would end her life. Time seemed to slow as she saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the mechanical precision with which he aimed for her heart. The shot came from an unexpected direction, Ben Morrison's rifle speaking with deadly accuracy from 50 yards away. Walsh jerked backward, his own shot going wild as Morrison's bullet found its mark. The corrupt deputy toppled from his perch, his body striking the rocks below, with the finality of absolute justice. "That was for Bill," Ben called grimly, working the lever of his rifle to chamber another round. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. Reed had seen Walsh fall, and his military training took over as he repositioned his remaining men to cut off their escape route. The draw was still reachable, but barely, and every second of delay made their odds worse. "The entrance!" Thatcher shouted, pointing to where muzzle flashes winked from the rocks on either side of the narrow passage. They were caught in the open, 50 yards from safety, with professional killers closing in from multiple directions. Josie's ammunition was running low, her horse was laboring from the hard run, and night was falling fast across the brutal landscape. Behind them, Jake's battle with Reed's ambush party had reached its own crisis point. She could hear her foreman's voice shouting orders, could see the flash of gunfire as honest men fought desperately against overwhelming odds. Everything they'd worked for, all the evidence they'd gathered, every hope for justice, it all came down to the next few minutes and whether they could survive long enough to reach the sanctuary of the draw. The smoking revolver in Thatcher's hand held 2 bullets. Her father's rifle had 3. Ben Morrison's weapon was empty, and he was working frantically to reload while guiding his horse with his knees. Against them stood Colonel Marcus Reed and at least 4 professional killers, all armed with repeating rifles, and the kind of cold determination that came from knowing failure meant exposure and disgrace. The odds couldn't have been worse. But sometimes, Josie reflected as she leveled her father's rifle at the nearest muzzle flash, the righteous fight, not because the odds are good, but because the cause is just, and there's no one else to stand between evil and the innocent. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and one of Reed's men cried out in pain and surprise. The final battle had begun. The final yards to the draw became a gauntlet of fire and death. Josie felt a bullet tug at her sleeve, felt another part her hair with deadly precision, but somehow she and Copper remained whole as they thundered toward the narrow opening between the rocks. Thatcher rode beside her, his smoking revolver speaking with measured authority. Each shot was placed with the precision of a man who'd learned that wasted ammunition meant death, and each one found its mark among Reed's positions. Ben Morrison had managed to reload and was providing covering fire from his position slightly behind them, his rifle barking steadily as he engaged the corrupt marshal's men. The sound of his weapon was different, now sharper, more focused, carrying the weight of personal vengeance, finally finding its target. They were 20 yards from the draw when disaster struck. Copper stumbled, her front hoof finding a prairie dog hole hidden in the twilight grass. The Mustang went down hard, throwing Josie clear but landing with a sickening crack that spoke of broken bones and ruined dreams. "Josie!" Thatcher's voice carried anguish and fury as he wheeled Buck around, the gelding responding like the cavalry mount he'd once been. She rolled clear of Copper's thrashing hooves, her father's rifle somehow still clutched in her hands, despite the jarring impact with the rocky ground. The Mustang tried to rise, failed, and lay still, except for the labored breathing that told its own tragic story. "Go!" Josie shouted to Thatcher, who was already dismounting to help her. "Don't stop for me." "Like hell," he replied, and suddenly he was there beside her, his strong hands lifting her to her feet, even as bullets whined around them like angry hornets. That's when Colonel Reed made his final fatal mistake. Instead of pressing his advantage with measured rifle fire, the corrupt marshal's military pride demanded a more decisive victory. He rose from cover with his remaining men, advancing in formation toward the two figures silhouetted against the rocky ground. "Surrender," Reed commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. There's nowhere left to run." What he hadn't counted on was the wedding ring glinting on the finger of the man who emerged from the shadows behind him, Ben Morrison, who'd circled around during the confusion and now stood with his rifle pressed against the base of Reed's skull. "Actually," Ben said quietly, "I think you're the one who's surrendered." The ring was a simple gold band, worn thin by years of faithful wear. It had belonged to Bill Morrison, and Ben had found it clutched in his brother's dead hand, along with a scrap of fabric that matched Reed's uniform. "Recognize this?" Ben asked, showing Reed the ring. "It was my brother's wedding band. Funny thing is, it's got blood on it that isn't Bill's. Same blood type as that bandana we found, according to Doc Mitchell. Care to explain how that happened?" Reed's face went white in the gathering darkness. "You can't prove anything with that. It could have come from anywhere." "Could have," Ben agreed pleasantly. "Except for the fact that it matches the scar on your left wrist, the one you got when Bill fought back before you shot him. The one that bled all over this ring when you tried to pry it off his dead finger." As if summoned by Ben's words, the evidence of Reed's guilt became visible as his sleeve rode up a jagged scar running from wrist to forearm, exactly the kind of wound that would have bled heavily for hours. "Thatcher," Josie called quietly, "your revolver." He understood immediately. The smoking peacemaker that had belonged to his sister, that had served them faithfully through the long fight, now held the final 2 bullets that would determine their fate. But Reed wasn't finished. With the desperate fury of a cornered animal, the corrupt marshal spun away from Ben's rifle, his own weapon swinging toward Josie and Thatcher. His finger was already tightening on the trigger when the peacemaker spoke its final word. The bullet took Reed's center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. The corrupt marshal's rifle fell from nerveless fingers as he stared down at the spreading crimson stain across his chest. "Bill Morrison was a good man," Thatcher said quietly, smoke still curling from the peacemaker's barrel. "He deserved better than dying for your greed." Reed tried to speak, blood frothing at his lips, but whatever final words he might have offered were lost as justice claimed its due. The man who'd orchestrated the murders of honest ranchers across 4 territories died as he'd lived, surrounded by violence and corruption, but ultimately alone. The remaining members of Reed's gang, seeing their leader fall and Ben Morrison's rifle trained on them, threw down their weapons in surrender. The fight was over, the conspiracy broken, and the evidence they'd gathered would finally see the light of justice. As the echoes of gunfire faded across the mountain landscape, Josie found herself in Thatcher's arms, both of them alive against all odds. The smoking revolver lay empty on the ground beside them. Mary Boone's wedding gift to her brother had fired its last shot in defense of the innocent. "Is it over?" Josie whispered against Thatcher's chest. "It's over," he confirmed, his arms tightening around her. "Reed's dead, Walsh is dead, and the evidence will speak for itself. Your father's death will be avenged, and Bill Morrison can finally rest in peace." In the distance, they could hear Jake's voice calling their names, the sound of honest men riding to their aid. The battle was won, justice would be served, and the territory would be free of the corruption that had claimed so many good lives. But more than that, Josie realized as she looked up into Thatcher's eyes, they'd found something worth fighting for in each other. Love born in laughter, tested by fire, and proven true in the crucible of shared danger. The smoking revolver had fired its last shot, but their story was just beginning. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the eastern hills of Whistling Gulch in the same shades of amber and gold that had witnessed so much change. Josie stood on the porch of the Double C Ranch house, her hand resting on the simple gold wedding band that had joined her life to Thatcher's 3 weeks earlier. The ceremony had been small and perfect, just family and close friends gathered in the little church where 3 generations of Calders had been married. Rosa had cried through the entire service. Jake had gruffly offered to give away the bride in place of her late father. And even grumpy old Charlie had been seen wiping his eyes during the vows. Now, as Mrs. Thatcher Boone, Josie watched her husband work with the horses in the corral, his gentle strength evident in every movement. The wanted poster that had once threatened to destroy their lives had been officially retracted, replaced by a letter of commendation from the territorial governor praising Thatcher's courage in exposing the corruption that had plagued the region. "Morning, Mrs. Boone," Jake called, approaching the porch with his characteristic purposeful stride. The graying foreman still carried his left arm a bit stiffly from the wound he'd taken during the final battle, but his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Morning, Jake. How are the new calves looking?" "Fat and sassy, just like they should be. That bull you and Thatcher bought with the reward money has already proved his worth." Jake's expression grew more serious. "Speaking of which, got a letter from Ben Morrison yesterday. Thought you'd want to hear the news." Josie took the letter with interest. Ben had become something of a territorial legend in the months following Reed's death, his investigation leading to the arrest of corrupt officials from 3 counties and the recovery of thousands of stolen cattle. More importantly, his tireless work had helped clear the names of a dozen honest ranchers who'd been falsely accused of crimes they didn't commit. "He's been offered a position with the Territorial Marshal's office," Jake continued. "Chief investigator, with authority to root out corruption wherever he finds it. Good pay too, and a chance to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." "He'll be perfect for the job," Josie said, remembering Ben's quiet determination and unshakable moral compass. His brother would be proud. The sound of hoofbeats announced another visitor, and Josie smiled as she recognized Dr. Sarah Mitchell riding into the yard. The frontier physician had become a regular guest at the Double C. Drawn both by her friendship with Josie and her professional interest in Thatcher's recovery from the physical and emotional wounds he'd carried for so long. "Sarah," Josie called, stepping down from the porch to greet her friend. "Perfect timing. Rosa's just pulled fresh bread from the oven, and I was hoping you'd stay for lunch." "I'd love to," Sarah replied, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who'd spent years making house calls across difficult country. "How's our patient doing?" They both looked toward the corral where Thatcher was working with a young colt, his patience and gentleness evident in every interaction. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for months had finally faded, replaced by the quiet contentment of a man who'd found his place in the world. "Better every day," Josie said softly. "He still has nightmares sometimes, about the people he couldn't save, the injustices he couldn't prevent, but they're getting less frequent." "Love is powerful medicine," Sarah observed with professional satisfaction. "And purpose, he's found both here." It was true. Thatcher had thrown himself into ranch work with the same dedication he'd once brought to tracking criminals, but now his efforts were directed toward building rather than pursuing, creating rather than investigating. He'd proven to have an almost mystical connection with horses, and neighboring ranchers had begun bringing their most difficult animals to him for training. Rosa appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron and beaming at the gathering crowd. "Dr. Mitchell, just in time. I have fresh bread and that honey Thatcher collected from the wild hives yesterday." As they settled around the kitchen, Tablanau, repaired from the bullet damage and bearing only the faintest scars of that violent night, Josie found herself marveling at how completely their lives had been transformed. The kitchen that had once been a battlefield was again the heart of the home, filled with laughter and the warmth of shared meals. "Any word on the trial?" Sarah asked, referring to the ongoing prosecution of the surviving members of Reed's network. "All convicted," Jake reported with satisfaction. "3 of them got life sentences, 2 got hanged, and the rest are looking at 20 years of hard labor." The judge said it was the most comprehensive case of territorial corruption he'd ever seen. "And the cattle operation?" "Completely dismantled. Every stolen head has been returned to its rightful owner. And the legitimate buyers who got taken in by the forged papers have been compensated from the seized assets." Jake's weathered face showed deep satisfaction. "Justice served, just like it should be." Thatcher entered the kitchen as Jake finished speaking, his clothes bearing the honest dust of hard work, and his face bright with the contentment of a man at peace with himself. He kissed Josie's forehead, a gesture so natural and tender that it made her heart skip, even after weeks of marriage, and took his place at the table. "What are we celebrating?" he asked, noting the festive mood. "Life," Josie replied simply. "Second chances. The fact that sometimes, when good people stand together, justice actually wins." "To justice," Sarah agreed, raising her coffee cup in a toast. "To family," Rosa added, her voice thick with emotion. "To love that grows from laughter," Thatcher said, his eyes meeting Josie's across the table. As they sat together in the sunlit kitchen, sharing Rosa's fresh bread and the golden honey that Thatcher had gathered from the wild places he now called home, Josie reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a man hanging upside down from a tree, continued through violence and conspiracy, and arrived at this place of peace and promise. The simple gold wedding band on her finger caught the morning light, its surface already showing the tiny scratches and wear marks that spoke of honest work and shared labor. It was, Josie thought, the perfect symbol of their new life together, not precious because it was perfect, but beautiful because it was real. Outside, Blue barked happily as he chased a butterfly through Rosa's herb garden, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in the morning sunshine. The Double C Ranch was whole again, stronger for having been tested, richer for having been shared. And in the kitchen, where 3 generations of Colders had gathered to face whatever challenges life might bring, the newest generation began to plan their future together, secure in the knowledge that love built on laughter and strengthened by trial could weather any storm. Sometimes, Josie reflected with deep satisfaction, the most unexpected beginnings led to the most beautiful endings. And sometimes, when you least expected it, love really could fall out of a tree and change everything forever.